In today's episode, we've got the Lord Protector of the Commonwealth of England, Inside Out Onesies, and an end to Storytime. It's time for your Jewish Week. Hey everyone, welcome to Your Jewish Week, the podcast for everything Jewish in the week ahead. I'm Rabbi Dovey. As always, this podcast is produced by Chabad.org and dedicated to all our brothers and sisters in the Holy Land. May Hashem keep them safe from all harm, and may all the hostages finally be freed to return to their families and loved ones. Today is Sunday, the 18th of Shvat, and if you happen to be visiting the Museum of Sock Monkeys in Long Grove, Illinois, you'll find that Shabbat candlelighting this week comes in at 5:13 p.m. If you're somewhere else, never fear. Halachic times for your location can be found quickly and easily at Chabad.org/times. Starting us off as usual with the weekly Torah portion, we've got the Parsha of Mishpatim. Fresh off of last week's account of the giving of the Torah, it's time to explore exactly what this Torah is all about. And to do that, I regret to inform you that Storytime is going to come to a close for the time being. From here on, the Torah will switch away from narrative mode and start sounding more like a book of divine instructions most of the time. Now, I can hear all you kids out there saying, hey, no fair. It was much more exciting when there were bloody rivers and splitting seas and stuff. Why is it suddenly reading like an instruction book? And to that I reply, yes, I hear you loud and clear, and I sympathize. But to be honest, that's kind of what the Torah is. The word Torah comes from the word hora'ah, which means teaching or instruction. The real question is, why did the Torah bother with narrative mode at all? But that's a discussion for another time. And don't worry, we've got some more narrative drama in the coming months, actually right at the end of this very Parsha. But for now, it's time to dig into some rules, regulations, ordinances, statutes, laws, directives, and all that other good stuff. First, Aliyah starts us off with the laws of a Jewish man who sells himself as a slave. It's not really slavery in the traditional sense. It's more like an indentured servant. He serves the master for a set amount of years, and the master has to give him food and shelter. We'll also talk about the obligations a husband has towards his wife, and the penalties for various things you shouldn't do, such as murder, and kidnapping, and abusing your parents. Right at the end, and rolling into Monday's reading, we'll have some laws of personal injury, followed by the laws of liability, if your cow hurts another animal with its horns, for example, which was the olden day equivalent of a car crash. You know, if cars were autonomous and occasionally got mad at other cars. We'll also talk about your liability for creating a public hazard, like an open pit. Tuesday, we'll head into an area that feels very close to home for me as a Californian, the laws of liability for fire. If you light a fire in your backyard, you're responsible for any damage it causes as it spreads. We'll also talk about someone who gives an item to a friend, whether the friend is watching it for him, borrowing it, or renting it. If something happens to the item, there's different levels of responsibility depending on the terms of the guardianship. Next, we've got the penalty for various kinds of personal misconduct, several inappropriate behaviors, practicing sorcery, sacrificing an animal to an idol, oppressing a widow or an orphan, and lending a fellow Jew money with interest. I just want to pause for a second and address the obvious here. These laws are all over the place, aren't they? We've got judicial laws, personal injury, and then suddenly we're talking about witchcraft and idolatrous sacrifices. I mean, what kind of instruction book is this, right? So here's the important thing to remember. The Torah is God's wisdom. God is infinite, so his wisdom is infinite too. So the Torah looks pretty straightforward at a casual glance, but if you look under the surface even a little bit, you'll very quickly realize that it is literally infinitely deep. And a lot of that hidden depth has to do with the order that the laws are presented in. The Talmud is full of this kind of thing. Often, two unrelated laws teach us something about each other just because they're written next to each other in the Torah. So that's something to keep in mind as we go through this quick overview of the laws. They seem random and unrelated, but everything is infinitely precise, and I encourage all of you to check out the explanations in depth. Having said that, Wednesday continues with the prohibition of cursing a judge, eating meat that has not been slaughtered properly, offering an animal as a sacrifice before it's 8 days old, and several kinds of misconduct related to the judicial system. We'll also speak about the obligation to redeem the firstborn son, give the tithes in their proper order, return lost animals to their owners, and help unload an overburdened animal that's being crushed under its load. Thursday will wrap up the laws for this week with the prohibition of lying and taking a bribe, the obligation to let the land rest every 7 years, also known as Shemitah, and the similar obligation to rest ourselves every Shabbat. We'll also mention the 3 major festivals and introduce the basis for the kosher laws. Friday, we'll swing back into narrative mode. See, that wasn't so hard, was it? With God telling the Jewish people that he is sending his angel to accompany them into the land of Israel. And going into the final reading, God lays out the tremendous blessings that come with keeping the Torah and mitzvos. Right at the very end, the narrative jumps back to before the events of last Parsha and relates some things that took place leading up to the giving of the Torah. Parshas Mishpatim contains 118 verses, so we're back to average length after last week's itty-bitty 72-verse portion. We've also got an extremely heavy dose of comments from Rashi explaining all the laws and their backgrounds, so you might want to budget some more time for your daily Torah study this week. The memory keys for this week's Parsha are the names Uziel and Hanani. As always, check out the link in the show notes for more insight into this week's keys. Moving on to the weekly Tanya, we left off last week with the Alter Rebbe explaining how avoiding sin is within easy reach of us all using our natural love for God. Well, this week we'll be swinging the other way. Beyond just avoiding sin, we're going to talk about actively doing good. Similar to what we explained last week, go back and give that a listen if you need a refresher, the Alter Rebbe makes the case that doing good is a natural inclination that every Jew has. It's only the delusion and influence of the evil inclination that gets in the way. By removing this negative influence, a Jew will naturally be driven to follow God's commandments. How do you remove this negative fog? Well, we explained last week that it naturally falls away during times of crisis, when a Jew can no longer delude himself into thinking that his sins do not separate him from God. When pushed against the wall, a Jew will endure the worst suffering rather than actively destroy his soul's connection with Hashem. So going into Monday's Tanya, the Alter Rebbe is going to explain how to bring that awareness into everyday non-crisis life. Think about this. You would, theoretically, endure the worst pain in the world rather than be cut off from God, right? You'd even forfeit your life. Well, getting off the couch and putting on tefillin, for example, is certainly a whole lot better than dying. Resisting the urge to sin is also a lot better than dying. It's hard, of course, but it's a lot better than dying. So if you die for Hashem, and you would, then can't you do this for him too? Tuesday, we arrive at my personal favorite part of Tanya, chapter 26. The Alter Rebbe pauses the conversation to bring your attention to a problem that could potentially derail your entire spiritual journey, and that problem is sadness. When a person is sad, he is unmotivated. The Tanya brings the example of 2 wrestlers grappling with each other. If one of them is joyful and confident, and the other is depressed and doubtful, he will be easily overcome, even if he's much stronger. If we aren't happy, we aren't strong. And if we aren't strong, we'll never overcome our evil inclinations. That's why being happy isn't just a perky, wholesome tip for life. This is dead serious. Happiness is a matter of life and death. Now the question becomes, how do you get happy? Particularly when things don't go your way, whether it's one of those annoying inconveniences or a major tragedy. So starting Wednesday and continuing straight into next week, the Alter Rebbe will walk us through different kinds of depressing influences and explain how to gain perspective that will allow us to be joyful regardless. In the Daily Rambam, the 3-chapter and Sefer HaMitzvos tracks are going to be moving right along with the laws of witnesses. Sunday and Monday, we'll be spending most of our time on the topic of Eidim Zomimim. That's when 2 witnesses say, for example, they saw Bob stealing a laptop at 2 a.m., and another 2 witnesses come and say, that's impossible. You couldn't have seen Bob then. You were with us that day at 2 a.m., stealing an entirely different laptop. The Torah law is that these false witnesses receive whatever punishment the defendant would have received if their frame-up had been successful. Tuesday will begin the laws of Mamrim, people who rebel against God in various ways, and moving into Wednesday and Thursday, that's going to take us into the laws of respecting your parents. And finally, Friday and Shabbat will dive into the laws of mourning and burial, which will continue into next week. And in the one chapter track, we're going to be getting involved in some really tangled situations regarding spiritual impurity. Sunday through Wednesday, we'll be discussing cases of doubt regarding impurity and some interesting factors that come into play. For instance, the law is different if the doubt arose in a public domain versus a private domain, even if the probability, statistically speaking, is the same. We'll get into that quite a bit. Thursday will begin the laws of impurity of food and drink, explaining when food can become impure and what we consider to be food as far as these laws are concerned. As always, if you'd like to learn more about anything you just heard, or if you're interested in joining one of the daily study cycles, check out the show notes for links and resources. All right, with the weekly overview done, it's time to take it day by day. Unfortunately, we're starting off Sunday, the 18th of Shavat, with a sad one, the anniversary of an infamous auto da fe. An auto da fe, in case you're not aware, was the Spanish Inquisition's term for the public punishment of a heretic. It's commonly associated with execution, particularly by being burned alive. And on this day, in the year 1639, 12 Jews met their fate in this very gruesome manner. Now, unfortunately, there were hundreds of auto da fes during the Inquisition's dreadful career, but what made this one notable is that it took place in the American continent, in the city of Lima, Peru. One of the victims, a philosopher and poet named Francisco Maldonado de Silva, had been in the Inquisition dungeons for 12 years prior to his execution. During that time, he had not only continued to reject Christianity, he had actually converted two Catholics to Judaism. Even in this tragic moment, the spirit of our holy nation shone through, and it is this same spirit that continues to keep us alive and strong to this day, while the Inquisition has long since become nothing more than a washed-out Monty Python sketch.
Nobody expects a Spanish Inquisition!
Sadly, as we move into Monday, we remember more tragedies from our past, this time from the year 1349, when the Jewish community of Basel, Switzerland were forced into specially built wooden huts and burned alive. This came in response to allegations that the Jews had poisoned the wells, which was allegedly supported by the Jews' own confession. Never mind that the confession had been extracted by the excruciating torture device known as the thumbscrew. To make the horrific tragedy even worse, the children of the community were taken away and forcibly baptized, sentencing them to a spiritual death which, as Hasidus often reminds us, is far worse for a Jew than physical death. Moving ahead to the modern day, just 2 short decades ago in 2002, the 19th of Shavat was the date of the murder of Daniel Pearl, a Jewish Wall Street Journal reporter stationed in Pakistan. Before being shockingly killed on camera by the terrorists who had kidnapped him, Daniel declared that, "My father is Jewish, my mother is Jewish, I'm Jewish." As the Alter Rebbe tells us in the Tanya for this week and last week, the essence of a Jew is connected to God with an unbreakable bond. In times of crisis, all else falls away, and we're left with the truth. And it was this truth that Daniel Pearl gave voice to in his final words. A teacher of mine once pointed out that we spend so little time on things we truly die for, our families, our religion, our creator, and so much time on things that ultimately don't really matter. As we remember the tragic story of Daniel Pearl and the appalling massacres of our people who died as proud Jews, I think it's an opportunity to check in with our priorities and challenge ourselves to spend more time on the things that really matter. All right, let's end off Monday with something a bit brighter, the miraculous rescue of Reb Aryeh Leib of Shpala, better known as the Shpaler Zayde. The Shpaler Zayde was a Rebbe and renowned miracle worker, and on one particular occasion in the year 1793, he was traveling home after participating in a Brit Milah ceremony. His route took him across a frozen river, which began to suddenly break beneath his feet, plunging him into the freezing water and putting his life in imminent danger. Miraculously, the Shpaler Zayde was saved, and he resolved to celebrate the day with a joyous Thanksgiving meal. To this day, descendants of the Shpaler Zayde come together for this celebratory occasion to give thanks to Hashem. Tuesday, the 20th of Shvat, we've got a very happy birthday to Asher, the son of Yaakov, our forefather. He was born in the year 2199, which comes out to about 1562 BCE. Asher was the second son of Zilpah, Leah's maidservant, and his name loosely translates to good fortune. Like all the sons of Yaakov, Asher was the founder of the tribe of Israel that bears his name. The women of this tribe were particularly known for their tremendous piety and personal conduct, and many of them became the wives of high priests. Moving on to Wednesday, the 21st of Shvat, we've got a historic day in the history of England. Now, like all proud Americans, I consider it my right to good-naturedly make fun of my British friends, and they respond by making fun of me right back, which kind of tells you all you need to know about our relationship. But one thing you can say about England is that Jews have lived there for a very long time. They have not, however, been treated all that well. In the year 1290, King Edward I expelled all Jews from his kingdom, beginning a period of Jewish exclusion that lasted almost 400 years. But on this day in the year 1657, the first Jewish resident in 3 centuries was at last granted a permit to live in England. The permit was granted by the most British-sounding guy imaginable, so to do him justice, I'm going to apologize in advance to my British listeners and give my best shot at the accent. Oliver Cromwell, Lord Protector of the Commonwealth of England, Scotland, and Ireland. Leaving Cromwell behind and moving on to some much holier people, Thursday the 22nd of Shvat, we've got the yahrzeit of Rebbetzin Chaya Mushka Schneerson, the wife of our Rebbe, often referred to simply as the Rebbetzin. Despite her revered status as the Rebbetzin of the Chabad movement, she shunned public attention. At one point, someone recognized her in a store and drew attention to her, and the Rebbetzin never stepped foot in that store again. But despite her low-key persona, the Rebbetzin was no pushover. From a young age, her father, the previous Rebbe, recognized her talents and involved her in his undercover work to strengthen Judaism under the communist regime. The work was highly illegal under Soviet anti-religious laws and very dangerous. It required calm nerves and an agile mind. At one point, the Rebbetzin was in her father's apartment as it was being ransacked by Soviet agents, who would go on to arrest her father that very night and nearly sentence him to death. The situation was catastrophic, not just for the previous Rebbe and his family, but for a handful of other contacts in the city who were in possession of incriminating documents. Thinking quickly, the Rebbetzin managed to inform her soon-to-be husband of the situation. She spotted him walking in the street and called down to him that guests have come to visit us. The future Rebbe immediately got the hint and quickly warned the underground network of the danger. Even after she married the Rebbe and became the mother to the entire Chabad movement, the Rebbetzin maintained her soft-spoken, understated dignity. She avoided the limelight so much that few Hasidim even knew what she looked like. For many, they only truly learned who she was after her passing on the 22nd of Shvat, when the Rebbe began to speak about her greatness. In her memory, the Rebbe established a worldwide Jewish birthday campaign, an initiative to spread awareness of the importance of one's Jewish birthday and how to celebrate it. Check out Chabad.org/birthday for some really great resources on this, along with a calculator to find out when your Hebrew birth date was, if you're not yet aware. The yahrzeit is also marked by the annual Conference of Shluchos, which takes place every year on the Shabbat closest to the date. For thousands of Chabad Rebbetzins around the world, it's a time to come together, connect, and inspire one another. And for thousands of husbands, it's a time of mostly chaos, inside-out onesies, and cereal and milk for dinner. For real, if you've got a Chabad rabbi in your life, cut him some slack this weekend because he's probably going to be losing his mind just a little bit. I myself am taking care of our little Leivik for the weekend, so if you hear some babbling in the background of next week's episode, you'll know why. Also on Thursday, we've got the yahrzeit of Reb Menachem Mendel of Kutsk, also known as the Kutzker Rebbe, in the year 1859. There's a teaching from the Kutzker Rebbe that's really fun to say, and also hits very deeply in our social media world. The Kutzker Rebbe would say as follows: if I am I, because you are you, and you are you, because I am I, then I am not I, and you are not you. But if I am I, because I am I, and you are you, because you are you, then I am I, and you are you. See why it's fun to say? I had to record like 3 takes of it before it finally came out right. In case you missed the message in all the tongue twisting, it's more or less this. If you define yourself by other people, you're not a person. If you, for example, sell seashells by the seashore just because she sells seashells by the seashore, then you're not you. You're just a puppet trying to put on the facade. And chances are the other person is also just putting on a show. So you aren't you and they aren't them. But if we stop trying to become anybody else and start being ourselves and tuning into the natural personality that God gave us, then we are truly we. And to wrap up today's episode, Shabbat, we've got a very special halachic note, Shabbat Mevorchim, the Shabbat preceding the new month. The name loosely translates as the Shabbat when we bless, and it refers to the blessing of the new month that we say right before the Musaf prayer, asking God to give us a good new month and take us out of this exile. It's also customary to wake up early and recite the entire Tehillim prior to the morning prayers, and to gather with other Jews for a festive Farbrengen, to inspire one another in our service of God. In Jewish history, Shabbat marks the yahrzeit of another special Rebbetzin, Rebbetzin Menucha Rachel Slonim. Rebbetzin Menucha Rachel was the daughter of Reb Dovber Shneyuri, the second Rebbe of Chabad, commonly referred to as the Mittler Rebbe. In her mid-40s, Rebbetzin Menucha Rachel and her family were sent by her father, who was then the current Rebbe, to strengthen the Jewish community in the Holy Land. The trip would be a long, uncomfortable one through dangerous territory. Worse still, it would take place in the winter, which made Rebbetzin Menucha Rachel apprehensive of catching a potentially fatal illness in the cold rain far from home. Her father reassured her with the words, "You will travel between the raindrops." And that's exactly what happened. The wagon driver who took the group on the first leg of their journey through driving rain would recount for the rest of his life how his wagon miraculously remained completely dry while his holy passengers were inside. The family at length arrived in the Holy Land and settled in the city of Hebron. Throughout her life, Rebbetzin Menucha Rachel would walk between many kinds of raindrops. There are many stories of her interactions with the local Arab peasants, who were often very hostile to the Jews. I'll attach a link to some of those stories in the show notes. Invariably, her holiness and righteousness earned the respect of even the most anti-Semitic agitators. Rebbetzin Menucha Rachel passed away on the 24th of Shevat in the year 1888. Her resting place was, sadly, desecrated at various times, notably after the infamous Hebron massacre in 1929. But in the 1980s, it was rediscovered and rededicated, and it is now a holy site that attracts thousands of visitors every year. In that sense, the story of Rebbetzin Menucha Rachel isn't that different from the story of our people as a whole. We've always been a small nation, surrounded by unfriendly neighbors. As we've seen this week in Jewish history, our exile has been full of catastrophes, massacres, and tragedies of all kinds. But here we are, a resilient nation that has outlived them all, outlasted them. On this long, long journey, we have traveled between the raindrops, and we are at last poised to greet the final redemption with Mashiach in the week ahead. Your Jewish Week is produced by Chabad.org, written and recorded by me, Rabbi W. Paltiel. Theme music by Levi Gloshav.